So we're going to look at the product rule now that we know about the power rule. The product rule helps us when we have two functions that are multiplied together and we want to take the derivative of them. Ultimately, there is an equation for this, and we can look at how the limits are actually used to find this. But you take the first function and you times it by the second function's derivative, and you add it to the second function multiplied by the derivative of the first function. So that is what we're going to be using to look at how to take the derivative of something like this. Now in this case here, there are two things being multiplied together. So we have our f of x is right here, this little portion here, and our g of x is here. Now what we're going to need is the derivative of f of x, because we're going to use it here, and we're going to need to have the derivative of g of x, because we're going to need it here. So using the power rule, the derivative of this, we're going to have 3 times 2, so you're going to have 6x, and it's 2 to the minus 1, so therefore it's a power of 1, plus 4. We also are going to need to take the derivative of g of x, so again, the 3 comes up front and we lower the degree by 1, so it's going to be 3x squared plus 2. So those are our two derivatives of our f of x and our g of x. So if we take the derivative of this whole thing, we take our first function, f of x, and we multiply it by the derivative of g of x, which is 3x squared plus 2, and we add it to our g of x function, and we multiply it by f of the derivative of f of x, so 6x plus 4. So we can see here, this is our f of x times by this, which is our derivative of g of x, and we add it to our g of x multiplied by the derivative of f of x. So now we're actually going to have to go through and work through this and simplify this. So I'll do that quite quickly here for you. So as you can see, I have distributed out 3x squared times 3x squared, 3x squared times 2, etc., etc. in that first bracket. And then I've added in, again, I've distributed this one, and I've gotten these terms, and then I combine my like terms to get our final derivative. So our next rule that we're going to look at is the quotient rule. And the quotient rule is basically an extension of the product. So what the quotient rule basically says is that when you have two functions, they can be, in this case we're going to look at polynomials, one over top of the other. How this one works is that we square the bottom, so g of x is going to be squared on the denominator, and on the numerator we're going to take the denominator times by the derivative of the numerator, subtract the numerator multiplied by the derivative of the denominator. Now, unlike the product rule, this one order really matters. It has to be your g of x subtract or multiplied by your function on the top of your numerator derivative, subtracting the numerator times by the derivative of the denominator. The order does matter, whereas in product rule, technically it's addition, you could do it in either order. So again, we're going to have to look at finding the derivative of your numerator and the derivative of our denominator, and then we're going to use the formula to find the overall derivative. So in this case here, this right here is going to be my f of x, it's my numerator, and down here this is going to be my g of x. So we're going to need to figure out what our derivative of f of x is, which in this case 3 times 3 is 9, x drop the degree by 1, so squared, plus 4. And your derivative of the denominator is going to be 3 times 5, so 15, x squared, again 3 minus 1, plus 4 times x. So there's my numerator derivative, there's my denominator derivative. So if I take the actual derivative of this whole thing, we're going to have on the top, we're going to have g of x, so the denominator first, and it gets multiplied by the derivative of f of x. So that's 9x squared plus 4. Then we subtract. Key thing is subtraction. Then our numerator, which is 3x cubed plus 4x plus 2, multiplied by the derivative of our denominator, which we found out to be 15x squared plus 4x. That whole thing is over top of g of x, g of x, not g prime of x, which is 5x cubed plus 2x squared plus 1, all squared. So once I've plugged them all in, I do need to distribute and combine and simplify my numerator. My denominator, I'm fine with you leaving this as something squared. So again, key thing, put your brackets in, because this whole thing, when it's distributed, you have to subtract off this whole thing when it's distributed. So you want to make sure you have this subtract this whole thing, so that way you are subtracting each of these terms from these ones. So then once you combine your terms, then you're left with this. Now for both the product rule and the quotient rule, we're going to be looking at simpler examples to start off with polynomials, just to get in the idea of how to use the product rule and the quotient rule. But this rule will go into play when we do trig, when we do logs, all the future types of differentiation that we're going to do. Whenever we need to take the derivative of two products of two functions or a quotient of two functions, this rule will come into play.